Tamsin Bradley. I'm Professor of International Development Studies here at the University of Portsmouth. I'm just going to say a few words about gender focus, and then I will introduce the topic for today's webinar and then hand straight over to our excellent speakers. So Gender Focus is an interactive platform. It's been created in order to bring together practitioners and academics, all of whom are committed and dedicated through their work to achieving gender and social justice. So the platform itself is facilitated by UOP, but also Big Blue, and you'll be hearing from the directors of Big Blue very shortly. So this webinar today on animation in and for development is the latest in our series of webinars. As I said, we will record it, so those that can't listen now can do so later. So please, if you haven't already joined up to our newsletter and to our social media feed, please do so. You'll see on the website it's a work in progress, and it's constantly being updated as we have new materials and insights to share. So please take a look and add yourselves to our mailing list. So the topic for today, as you know, is looking at the links between, or the use rather, of animation within development. And I know from my own work within ending violence against women and girls, I have found working with animators and illustrators a really powerful and important means for communicating what are often very sensitive messages and very personal stories, but through animation we're able to really communicate very powerful messages around the necessity for transformation and social change, which has lasting impact to those that watch and hear that messaging. So for us, it's really exciting to be able to put together this webinar to look in much more detail into why animation is a growing field within development in a number of different industries, because of this growing recognition that it is such a powerful mechanism for communication. So I'm going to stop there because I'm not the speaker today, but I will hand over to Louis Netter, who is member of staff at the University of Portsmouth. He's the course leader for our illustration and animation degree program. So he is going to start today, and then he will hand over to Sajid and Saad, who are the directors of Big Blue Communications, and they will pick up and say a little bit more about the work that they do. In terms of questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I will keep an eye on that, but we will respond to questions at the end, so after both presentations. So I am going to stop there and hand over to Louis.
Hello, thank you, Tamsin. I'm not the course leader, but I'm a senior lecturer in illustration. We do have animation sort of pathways in illustration, but we don't specifically teach kind of animation. We do have a BA course that does do that. But today, what I'm going to really talk about is a little bit more of a theoretical approach to how animation really functions, and particularly how animation functions as nonfiction, which of course is critical to animation in research, animation in development, because we're dealing with nonfiction content and themes and so forth. And of course, there's an interesting interplay between nonfiction, real data, real lives, and the sort of artificial construct that is animation, that is sort of all the stylistic choices that go into it and so forth. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And so the nonfiction animated film is a critical aspect of this. This paper aims to explore specific examples of the nonfiction animated film and highlight the ways in which those films effectively exploit, arouse, excite, and amplify our understanding of the real through the inevitable abstractions of drawn, painted, sculpted, and digitally manipulated moving images. Additionally, I'll look at my own film, Art and Gender in South Sudan, and speak as a practitioner about making choices that relate to the reading of the film as a piece of nonfiction. So this particular shot is from a film, Waltz with Bashir, by Ari Folman, which I highly recommend. And it was a really groundbreaking early example of nonfiction in film, and caused quite a lot of discussion, even a little bit of controversy. I'm not going to touch on this particular film because it's very well explored in academic literature, but it's an interesting one to take a look at if you want to sort of see some of the beginnings of this field of nonfiction animation. But animation as an art form is vastly diverse in its formal and technical properties, and definitely embraces a wide spectrum of content, from fiction to nonfiction, from the figurative to the abstract, and all points in between and beyond. The prevailing conception of animation is rooted in the dominance and influence of early pioneers such as Walt Disney and the Fleischer brothers, and work that is made for young and old audiences alike. Central to our understanding of animation is the fundamental conceit that moving people, animals, and objects have the illusion of life through their animated properties, and that we imbue life through some corporeal assimilation with that movement, essentially meaning that we understand that they're alive through looking at our own movement, our own bodies, and so forth. Ernst Christ notes that images catch reality, but that our process of understanding them involves recognition of the known and holding reality. The image can then be seen as a container of information, which, like a code, requires the viewer to formally reconstruct and align his or her understanding of the world with the visual language that formally makes up the work. Gombrich noted what we call reading an image may perhaps be better described as testing it for potentialities, trying out what fits, eventually achieving a tenable hypothesis. The implications of the image, how we read it and understand it, plays a significant role in the development and proliferation of animation more broadly, and specifically into nonfiction. The ubiquity of the photographic image and the changing perception of it as an article of undisputed truth has moved towards more circumspection and awareness of the technological possibilities for manipulation and altered reality. The photograph is no longer contains sort of impenetrable truth, because of course we know that things can be changed, manipulated. As New Ehrlich notes, once animation's main structuring point of comparison, photographic imagery, starts to become increasingly destabilized, animation's long assumed artificiality is opened up for significant consideration as well. The form and formation of animation makes explicit its facture, and therefore any attempt to explore factual material will acknowledge the artificiality inherent in the process. A drawing is an elaborate symbol, after all, and highly subjective, pulling directly from an individual's perception, experience viewing drawings, artwork, and conceptual conclusions or tenable hypotheses about the image. Still, animation has many advantages from the photographic. For one, it's more agile. The animation can hone in on specific moments of interest and highlight subjects in a multitude of ways, which can promote understanding, bring clarity, and identify salient aspects of a narrative. It can also subjectify, emotionalize, and dramatize aspects of a narrative, which can promote empathy, understanding, and connectivity with related subjects, putting the work in a broader context. Animation can also utilize visual metaphor as a useful device for exploring thematic material present in nonfiction and for dealing with content in a sensitive, abstracted way. This will be evident in Art and Gender in South Sudan. Philip Costa-Luz notes, when animated documentaries present memories, stories about characters, or historical events, we cannot disassociate them from a reality just because the representation is graphical and manipulated by animators. He notes in the animated documentary Guantanamo Bay, The Hunger Strikes, how drawn images do not detract from the dramatic weight of how the subjects were treated. Instead, he notes the wide reception and appeal of animated works and how their friendly connection to childhood media enables an initial openness. This contrast between the seriousness of the subject matter and drawn animated lines, which evoke for many a connection to childhood, relates directly to how the artist utilizes his tool to create an evocative new reality, which stands in for the objective reality of the content. Neil Kahn notes of drawing, but can be seen in any formally applied art. Drawing is more like language. It uses schemas that are stored in memory and then combined using rule systems, broadly analogous to morphology and phonology in speech. The artist's visual language enables entry into the content of the work and subjectifies it, creating a new interpretive space outside of the assumption of materiality that photographic material provides. In other words, the stylistic choices are disconnected from the photographic and the real, which sort of forces us to kind of confront a new space of consideration, essentially. Nia Ehrlich notes that in the age of screens and fast-moving technological innovations, there is a requirement for forms and strategies of representation beyond the photographic mimetic. This opens up broader applications for animation, a medium with the capacity and flexibility to handle an ever more complex landscape of media and ideas. So in practice, animation is widely divergent, encompassing not only a variety of styles, but content which often challenges widely held views, histories, and cultural norms. Nonfiction topics include environmental science, racism, autobiography, marginalized histories, rethinking history, politics, and social ills, to name a few. The choices made by animators in these films are consequential, but as noted before, the new reality made by the artist's visual language is a durable space, made more accessible by the aforementioned proliferation of media on screens and the wider virtualization of culture. We sort of were more open to understanding, accepting animation because our media diet is widely diverse, and we've seen so much kind of animation come into apps and so forth. Multimedia animations have been embraced by audiences, as seen in the winning of awards, see Yellow Fever, we'll watch that later, and demonstrate that media is fluid, owing to a growing sophistication among viewers who consume diverse types of media. Paula Callis notes, this interplay between the photographic realism and fabricated renditions of the image within animation generate an aesthetic diversity that cannot be easily placed within rigid categories of the moving image. For the purposes of this paper, I'm seeing creative and stylistic choices in animation as attending to the content primarily, and not as problematic competing image types. In fact, although my own animation does not include photography, I see the discipline of nonfiction animation as necessarily open to all media, including photography. Equally, Niccolò Ceccarelli notes, with its conceptual distance from the realism of live footage, animation also offers a comfort zone where the powers of allegorical and metaphorical figures could be exploited without producing a major breakaway to the objectivity usually associated with informative material. Again, creating a sort of safe space to consider these ideas and subjects without the often hyper specificity of photography. The significant strength of animation lies not in its facture, but the sum of its effects, namely a new space from which ideas can be explored, utilizing an infinite array of symbols, metaphors, and contexts. My own animation, Art and Gender in South Sudan, uses findings from Professor Tamsin Bradley's research in South Sudan on artistic practices and gender. In talking with Tamsin about the findings and looking at transcripts from story circles that were conducted on the ground, it was apparent that the nature and consequence of artistic practice for these displaced, war-torn women was not straightforward. The practices had provided employment, income, continuance of tradition, independence, and resilience, but also reinforced negative cultural and behavioral traditions around the ownership of women, often resulting in violence. Immediately, this idea of positive and negative came to the fore as an important thing to communicate, and something that the animation can do well through the switching of modes to reflect important shifts. Additionally, the backdrop of political and social upheaval due to war and displacement provided an important layer for understanding the complexities experienced by men and women in South Sudan. The process of animation does not always start with a formal script. Instead, it often requires an understanding of the visual world of the story. My first preference typically is to do drawing on the ground, but COVID made this impossible. Weren't able to travel and so forth. So there had to be a bit of an imaginative leap there. In this case, that meant exploring South Sudan in photographs and thinking about compelling visual metaphors which would enable the often difficult subject matter to be sensitively understood, and to use metaphorical transitions that emphasized linked ideas, scenes, and shared struggles. The storyboard, with its loosely structured and very rough script, became the basis for a much more refined script which aimed to set out the findings clearly so that they could be made visually compelling in the animation. The animation then becomes a kind of secondary text. I would argue that the secondary text is an emotive and conceptual one. Annabelle Honus Rowe notes, animation, however, is increasingly being used as a tool to evoke the experiential in the form of ideas, feelings, and sensibilities. By visualizing these invisible aspects of life, often in an abstract or symbolic style, animation that functions in this evocative way allows us to imagine the world from someone else's perspective. That's ultimately the strength. Different perspectives, different ways of seeing those perspectives, different ways of exploring and exploding experience and making that experience universal through graphical means. My choice to make this animation in a variety of different animation styles was intentional. I'd recently finished a music video that incorporated stop frame, hand-drawn, experimental ink, digital, and even digital microscope animation. The resulting film managed to be a patchwork of not just styles, but ideas contained in those choices. The film shifts ably from different textures, and while doing so, offers up a new lens from which to see the subject of the song. In this case, it was the abandonment of God, but not in a religious way. So that hugely inspired my mixed media approach to this subject. And as you'll see in exploring these scenes, that also enabled the opening up of different ways of understanding these experiences, and by moving them to multiple different characters. So in this particular figure, the location of the soon-to-be married woman is directly above the shaking hands, which will seal her fate in marriage. This is using clear compositional design to reinforce the lack of agency on the part of the woman as she looks on, uncertain of the full implications of the exchange involving bride price. The cattle are often part of this exchange, along with the Malaya bedsheet. This animated sequence is utilizing a well-used technique, particularly in independent animation, called boiling. This is when the two or three images are looped that are not exact traces, and it creates a wiggle, but also gives the impression of life and movement. Through these constructed animated image, the film is able to, as Annabelle Honus Rowe notes, depict the in here of personal experiences and the out there of observable events. Through animation, we can achieve a level of intimacy and relational experience through compositional devices, which are difficult to achieve in other media. So we're able to actually get a more intimate sense of experience through animation, something that could be achieved in film, but it would be difficult and involve several actors and a variety of special effects. In this particular scene, the stop frame character is contemplating going home, as we see her from a few angles as she pauses before the door. Although we see this puppet on several occasions, we are not to assume that this is the central character. Instead, she bookends the animation and elicits a different kind of emotive response. This is the strength of working in mixed media animation. Different scenes that are done utilizing different tools give us other ways of understanding the multiplicity of experience. And crucially, in the case of this animation, we consider the experience of multiple women through different characterizations. In an animation of this sort that deals with difficult experiences that are dealt with by numerous women, it is imperative to have more than one character and to utilize media to bring those characters into different contexts. Here, we shift from the stop frame to 2D animation, although our gaze matches that of our previous character, the stop frame lady. We see here the source of her hesitation, anxiety, and possible fear. Matching the sheet and dwelling that we saw previously, the intention here was to open up this experience beyond that of the character. Although we are inhabiting her line of sight, it is an open question whether this is her experience or the experience of another. This was intentionally open-ended and, as mentioned previously, was done to explore a more universal experience on the part of women in South Sudan. These different aesthetic spaces create different temporalities to consider, and with the benefit of isolating important subjects and dimensional play. Additionally, there is intentionally no aim to create archetypes of good and bad characters here. The intention is to explore the complexity of experience and not to overcharge the imagery towards simplicity or distraction. In this scene, my intention was to abstract violence by countering two silhouettes. The female figure is intentionally put in a corner with no way out. Visualizing violence such as this requires sensitivity in the image and more needs to be implied than visualized. The shadows also hint at a kind of equality. Psychic damage has been felt by both men and women due to years of war, displacement, and insecurity. As Sheila Safian notes, not only does iconic imagery make difficult material more palatable, it also allows an enhanced level of identification as barriers between subject and viewer are diminished. And this is one of the few still images in the film, which is panned across to show numerous women and children displaced by war. Still images like this provide a somewhat more realistic aesthetic and aim to emotionalize the suffering of these women and families in a way that is more internalized. As Chris notes about how we understand made images, we started out as part of the world which the artist created. We end as co-creators. We identify ourselves with the artist. So ultimately, when you look at a piece of art, of a painting or sculpture or something, we assimilate ourselves into the piece through a kind of recreative trace of what the artist has done, which actually builds more intimacy with the subject matter. As noted above about visual language, in animation, we understand the content through an amalgamation of the artist's visual world, the construct, the presentation. And here in this particular sequence, the center of the flower starts out initially as a sun, which descends and becomes the Malaya design. The intention here was to portray optimism through the bright colors and playful unfolding of the design. The film plays on both sharp contrast and subtle shifts between positive and negative attributes, and utilizes color and mood to make these conceptual shifts explicit. This Zande sculpture was turned into a stop frame animation to relate to the nature of his craft. He represents the care and attention to his craft, but also a positive model for men in South Sudan who sing love songs as they work. It was intentional to have male puppets as well as female to forge understanding and empathy in the animation. The puppets are, after all, highly evocative and bring a layer of understanding and compassion that 2D animation does not, or does slightly less. Maureen Furness notes, stop motion animation is apt to provoke that experience, the uncanny, to a greater extent than drawn, painted, or most digital 3D animation. The reason is that stop motion objects, clay, wooden, latex, or pixelated human, already have a real life status, even before they are set in motion. So this is the uncanny. I mean, there's something about moving objects, irrespective of their material properties, that engage us in a very different way. This particular sequence begins with a woman in distress as a white line drawing in a black darkened room. Her teardrop falls from her eye and descends down, turning red in the next scene, or into a sort of bucket of red, but we're not entirely sure initially. This moment reflects a transition that is common in animation, a link forged from one scene to the next. However, this particular scene would initially indicate a transition from tears to something resembling blood. The transition, however, is to a positive, the work that men and women do in the making of baskets. The red is dye that is used to create elaborate colored and colors these reeds, essentially. These kind of transitions can be conceptually useful and engage the viewer in a game of expectation, which challenges initial conclusions. It creates a kind of surprise, which, through a flip of expectation, creates a pleasing outcome to something thought to be initially negative. So I'm now going to show you the film. And I'm going to show you my film initially, and then I will show you a few other films which I'd just like you to consider some of this use of mixed media and so forth.
South Sudan society is highly gendered, with marriage at the heart. Bride price is central to the process of marriage, but involves a bride being bought by her prospective husband. This unhelpfully brings inequality into their relationships from the start, and often leads to men feeling like they own their wives. Ownership sanctions the use of violence. Intimate partner violence is very high in South Sudan. Conflict, displacement, resettlement, and struggle. South Sudan is a new country with old problems. War and its aftermath shapes the country today. A fragile state navigates its future. The stress of war brings stress into households, which tips over into violence. Women in conflict settings are often left alone as husbands have gone to war or been killed. They have to find ways to feed their children and keep going. People are displaced and families are uprooted. What survives, however, are artistic practices that have been passed down for generations.
Hi, Lou. I'm just checking you're still with us. I think we're having a few technical problems.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I was talking to myself there for a second. I'm just going to show you just a couple more little clips of films that that sort of evidence some of the things I've been talking about in terms of nonfiction.
Yeah, just don't mute yourself because I think it affects us being able to hear what you're sharing.
Yeah. Oh, did you not? Oh, right. Okay. Okay, I'm going to show you a part of, this is called Guantanamo Bay hunger strike, and it was actually funded by The Guardian newspaper. And this shows, it's quite graphic, it's quite intense, but does show the power of animation and also dealing with clearly very difficult subject matter. So I'm just going to show you that.
On the chest, throat, stomach. They put you on a chair. Reminds me of an execution chair. Your legs and shoulders are tied with belts. If the tube goes in the wrong way, the liquid might get into your lungs.
Okay, it appears that that ad kind of may have taken that, but I think you get the idea there. Very, very difficult stories about a group of prisoners that chose to go on a hunger strike and they're forced feeding. I want to show you this as well. Now, this particular animation shows something which was very popular in the sort of from 2010 onwards. It was called something called whiteboard animation. And I just want to show you a little bit of this. This might be particularly interesting to people dealing with scientific and environmental subjects. We'll watch a little bit of this. I think this does a good job of, again, I think what animation does well is explore complexity.
Breastfeeding from their mothers. Is that?
Just hold on, just need to get rid of this here. Okay, let's take a little look at this here.
Who are they? Well, let's start with the government. Now, my friends tell me I should use a tank to symbolize the government, and that's true in many countries and increasingly in our own. After all, more than 50% of our federal tax money is now going to the military. But I'm using a person to symbolize the government because I hold true to the vision and values the government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. It's the government's job to watch out for us, to take care of us. That's their job. Then along came the corporation. Now, the reason the corporation looks bigger than the government is that the corporation is bigger than the government. Of the 100 largest economies on Earth now, 51 are corporations. And as the corporation has grown in size and power, we've seen a little change in the government where they're a little more concerned in making sure everything's working out for those guys than for us. Okay, so let's see what else is missing from this picture. We'll start with extraction, which is a fancy word for natural resource exploitation, which is a fancy word for trashing the planet. What this looks like is we chop down the trees, we blow up mountains to get the metals inside, we use up all the water, and we wipe out the animals. So here we are running up against our first limit. We are running out of resources. We are using too much stuff. Now, I know this can be hard to hear, but it's the truth, so we've got to deal with it. In the past 3 decades alone, 1/3 of the planet's natural resource space has been consumed, gone. We are cutting and mining and hauling and trashing the place so fast that we're undermining the planet's very ability for people to live here.
Okay, and one last one that I want to share with you, which for me pulls together a lot of the strengths and the strands that I've been talking about today, which is ultimately about stylistic choice and its impact on how we think or rethink about certain subjects. And this is a really beautiful animation which comes out of Royal College of Art. And as I mentioned about this mixing of the photographic and the sort of stylistic hand rendered media, this animation really manages that space deftly, and I think is a really important one. moving forward to thinking, because I think as a research film, nonfiction research film, or a film for development, my personal belief is it's always important to make good art. If we can make good art, we can engage more people, more senses. We can gain a greater emotional response and then transform that emotional response into action. That's certainly my goal, and I think great art is capable of doing that. So I want to show you this. This is called Yellow Fever. And I'll show you, this is the one film I will show you in full because it certainly deserves to be in full. Just trying to make this full screen. It may not be capable.
My sister and I are teenagers. We are having our hair braided at the hair salon. My magazine is on my lap because it hurts too much to read. My sister is asleep. She is chocolate. I am toffee. The woman tugging on my hair is mkorogo, a mixture of both, meaning she could only afford enough beauty cream to bleach her hands and face, which are now yellow. Her true ebony persists on the length of her upper arms, the bow of her stomach, the breadth of her thighs. I see the West seeing us, and in response, this woman had worked hard to erase the element that marks her as truly African. Her own melanin, her own skin. I watched her in the mirror. She stared back at me, pitying her. I closed my eyes and took the pain as she tugged harder on the long, straight nylon hair made in China and braided onto my head.
So the African was confused. So they started now to be a conflict. So they go to extremes. In a white complexion was beauty. And that is now what drove the girls to try and use the beauty creams to bleach themselves.
I really want to be American instead of a Kenyan. If I was American, I would be white, and I love being white.
Like you know you can't change.
I know I can.
How?
It's magic. Magic is real.
So if you had magic, you would do what?
I would change myself into white hair and white skin.
I've seen people put those creams on little babies.
This is a cream. I spread it carefully onto my skin and pray for it to take effect. Day and night, and night and day, and night and day, day and night. I just want to be night and days. I just want to be. I just want to be. And days. I just want to be day and night. This is a cream. This is a cream. There's the you imagine yourself to be, the one you hate, the one you despise. Your reflection is almost a monster to you. You feel let down by it. taunted, even attacked. It becomes real, as if another person.
What was making you straighten our hair?
For my girls to look much better.
You thought that we would look better if our hair was...
Look better, it will be easier for me to manage. I just thought I was doing right.
This fever, we then pass on to our children.
Our new improved formula that delicately brightens your skin up to 5 shades lighter for true beauty.
With the coarse weave of my mother's carpet beneath our feet, I asked my niece this question.
Now, Abby, tell me, yeah?
Yes.
If you're here saying that you want to be white,
Yes.
how does that make you feel about the way you look when you're looking in the mirror?
It makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable.
The fault lines within, we overwrite with borders. Hierarchies of beauty cut.
Okay, I think just for the time, I will stop it there. Yeah, and that's, I think you can see there with the mixed photographic and the animation and so forth. I think ultimately, my personal feeling is best not to be a purist about animation and filmic forms, that all these different things can actually contribute to telling wider, more engrossing stories. And that's me, and I shall hand it off to Sajid.
That's great. Thanks so much, Louis, for handing over. Hi, everyone. Firstly, thanks to Professor Tamsin and to the University of Portsmouth for the opportunity to be with you all today. My name is Sajid, and I launched a company with my brother Saad, who's also part of this call. The company is called Big Blue Communications, and we launched it a few years ago specifically to help researchers and scientists and international development programs and organizations to communicate their research and data in compelling and engaging ways. So the ways that we do that are through animation, through film, through design, through content writing, and then also through online experiences like through website design and also mobile phone application development. We've actually been working with the Gender Focus platform for some time now, and then we've also had the privilege of working with Professor Tamsin on a few occasions in the past too. This section of the webinar will be maybe like 10 minutes. I'm just going to share my screen with you quickly here, just so you can see just a quick visual. Hopefully you should be able to see that now. That you should see on your screen. I should be on the right or on the left, and then there should also be a PDF slide with a blue background, just showing an outline of what this presentation will be like. So it starts with a thank you to you all, and then the outline, and then a short video. So Louis, I think, has done a wonderful exploration of the connection between animation and research, and so I'll talk a little bit about what it's like on the industry side. I will start by saying that I'm not an animator. I wish I was. But rather, I work with a team of amazing visualizers. Some of them are actually in the audience today. My role is more on the scripting side, on the story side, and then working with researchers and with scientists to make sure that the whole animation package tells a complete story. So here, I'm just going to show you a quick video. Now, just bear with me, please. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to share with you a quick video, which I think outlines the connection between research communication and animation quite well. So this video is just about 90 seconds long. So I thought we can watch that and then we can come back and do the rest of the webinar. Thanks.
Animation is all around us, in education, entertainment, and science. It's in documentaries, websites, apps, and ads. Animation is now a priceless tool to communicate research and data. It simplifies complexity. It adds emotion and sparks imaginations. It goes to physical and imaginary spaces where cameras cannot. And it crosses borders, language barriers, and reading disabilities. Animation converts the knowledge of experts into experiences that change minds and behaviors. It educates and it clarifies. And when it is done well, it can really change the way people see things. Think about how animation, stories, music, and design can amplify your own research. Think about the impact your research could make. Here at Big Blue, we animate the research that changes the world. We work with scientists, academics, and other great minds whose knowledge helps humanity and the planet. And we are here to help you too.
Great, thanks. I'm just seeing a message from Debashi saying, can I please play it again? Can I just get confirmation that that video was playing okay for everyone?
It played okay. It was a little bit still, but it played.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks, Lee. So I will not I will not play it again then. That's great. Okay, thanks for that. So I'm just going to go back to share my screen again, and then we're just going to look at some of the slides here. So you should be able to see. Oops, sorry about that. You should be able to see some slides on the screen now. Please let me know if you cannot see that. So yeah, that video is just a short introduction to the connection between research communication and animation that was produced by the talented people that work on our team. It's kind of a primer that we show to researchers and to scientists to help them think about how to maybe take some complex piece of research or some complex piece of data and then communicate it in a visual way, because research and data can after all quite often be quite complex. It's generally created by quite specialist people, but then it has to be communicated to a non-specialist audience. So that's why tools like animation and film and design can be so helpful. So I thought maybe next what we can look at on the screen here are just some quick guidelines. So we often I have a full list of guidelines which we show to people at the beginning of an animation or a production project. Some of the more fun ones or more tongue-in-cheek ones are just shown on the screen here. And I thought it would be useful to mention these guidelines just to show actually how much of the animation process takes place outside of the process of visualization. So much of being able to animate well is actually being able to first understand your audience and then find the language, the visual language also that can communicate with them in a way that they can understand, but then also in a way that can make an impact on them too. So when an animation is being produced, there's plain language, there's emotional buy-in, there's a great script, and then of course there's great sound, because great sound is after all is 50% of a production. So the story, your ability to communicate clearly, and then the script and the music and the voice, these can all play a really huge role in helping an audience understand a piece of research and then also hopefully connect with it and engage with it in some meaningful way too. And then, of course, there's also the visuals as well. So I'm just going to go to another screen here. So hopefully you can see another slide here with a title that says team effort. So building on the last slide, I thought it might be useful to show this visual too. So this visual shows the production process, and it also shows the different kinds of people who might be involved in a production. So it's not definite that every production will have all of these people, but quite often there'll be some kind of combination of all these people involved. So that might be the research and the scientists who are commissioning the animation in the beginning, and then supporting them might be a writer, visualizers, voice artists, animators, audio production people, and then also promoters too. So it's actually when you have all of these people come together and they share like some kind of aligned vision, that's really actually when like a truly effective kind of communication of research can happen. So I just wanted to show this to demonstrate like just how much kind of background thought and planning and how much of a team effort it can be to create a production, like an animation production. And then this is the final slide here. I just wanted to spend a few, maybe just 2 or 3 minutes just talking about this concept of accessibility. So just as a fun question, I thought it might be fun just to ask everyone, like, what is it that you think is the average reading age level in the UK? So I'll ask that question again. What do you think is the average reading age level in the UK? So just take like a few seconds to think about it. If anybody wants to write an answer into the chat box, that's great. I can assure you that the number is actually lower than what most people guess it is. Yeah, so the average reading age level in the UK is actually somewhere around age 9. So that means that if the average UK citizen probably reads at around an age 9 reading level. So why is that something useful to consider for the communication of research and then animation? Well, firstly, it helps you to plan your messages. So the truth is that most people wildly overestimate the ability of their audience to understand what it is that they're saying. So if your language is quite technical, or if your concepts are quite difficult to understand, then it's quite likely that you need to spend some kind of time clarifying and simplifying your message, and then making sure that as many people as possible in your audience can understand it. So that's one reason why animation can be so useful, because it kind of communicates beyond language barriers. So if I can just give like an example, Tamsin, for instance, Professor Tamsin is like an example of a researcher who by nature knows how to communicate in very accessible ways. So that means when you talk to Tamsin about her research, she knows how to speak in very plain language. She knows how to communicate very clearly. And so that makes the starting point for any kind of communication of research, and also any kind of animation production. The process is relatively straightforward, because there's not so much decoding of language that has to take place. Because if you do want to make an impact with the research that you're trying to communicate, you do need to make sure that you're using kind of short sentences, short words, short ideas, absurdly plain language. Even if you're speaking to a technical audience or to a group of people who might already be familiar with what you're saying, there's a big chance that they might be distracted, or maybe the quality of the audio that you're communicating with them, it might be quite low. Maybe you're on a Zoom call and maybe the video and the audio is not working so well. Maybe there's people in the audience who are speaking several different languages. So you really want to kind of, as much as you can, simplify the messages that you're producing. Of course, you might have some kind of specialist audience who already understands what it is that you're saying, but even in those cases, it really does help to just make all your messaging as simple as possible. For instance, like if you're talking with quite often researchers and scientists, they have to engage with journalists in some kind of way, because journalists end up becoming the amplifiers for any kind of research that's published. So journalists are very good at simplifying language. That's kind of what they do all day. But the majority of the time, they will not have a specialist background in the kind of in the area that a researcher or a scientist is trying to communicate. So it's really important for a researcher or a scientist to be able to communicate with a journalist in very, very plain language in a very, very short period of time, because journalists are so busy. And so that's where animation can also be very useful as well, because if you are producing a press release, let's say, or you have a new piece of research to launch, it's actually really easy just to say to a journalist, also, please just watch this 1 minute animation or a 90-second animation to get a good overview of what it is that we're trying to communicate. So anyway, so how does all this like relate back to animation? Well, animation, like film or like visuals, it's such a powerful tool for being able to reach across communication gaps and make a connection with an audience. So that's kind of the final thought that I just wanted to leave everyone with is just this sort of final reflection on accessibility. You know, like when people talk about accessibility, quite often the discussion takes place in quite a technical context, meaning people just want to make sure that the right colors are used and that the text is large enough and that, you know, the sound quality is good enough. But actually, accessibility to your research or to your data is really about being able to simplify what is very complex, being able to tell a clear story, acknowledging that maybe there are many people in your audience who are maybe suffering some kind of language disability, reading disability, physical impairment. And then also it's inevitable that researchers are always going to be making some kind of assumptions, or they might always have some biases that are actually going to prevent the audience from being able to connect with that research so well. So just again, yeah, just wanted to close off with that idea that the process of animation, which is so much about script writing, it's about coming up with a great story, it's about coming up with great audio, it's about choosing the right music. All of this stuff, all of this process that happens, that's actually making the research so much more accessible to people who you're trying to communicate with. So I thought I'd just round it off with that final thought, and maybe turn it over to Tamsin and Louis now, and maybe we can move to the question answer part of the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sajid, and also Louis. It's just been a really fascinating webinar so far. So I open it to the floor. Please feel free to put your hand up and pose a question. We do have a few in the chat box, so we can maybe start with those. But if I can just take the liberty of perhaps jumping in before we go into the chat and just ask a question. I guess it's probably mainly directed towards Big Blue, and it's just really around your reflections in terms of the level of interest that the scientific and research community are now giving to animation, and really your reflections on how that may have changed, if it's increased or decreased, and why you think that might be.
Sure. Thanks, Tamsin. I can answer that. So I guess one quite exciting thing that's come up is maybe because people are they're surrounded by animation so much now on a daily basis. Like every time you open up your social media, even within your news feed, you're seeing a lot of animation, but even social media itself is animated. Like every time you open up an app, the app has so much animation within it itself. So I think what we're finding now is that, you know, maybe in the past, a researcher or a scientist or a group of people might come to our team and say, we'd like to communicate in some piece of research. Do you have ideas for how to do that? And we would suggest animation. But what's happening now is that sometimes researchers and scientists are actually coming to us saying, we would like to produce an animation. So like that's actually a really interesting shift for us, you know? And so when we see like project opportunities come up online, it's not unusual now to actually have a request for an animation actually be built into the project, meaning somebody might say, I'd like to produce a piece of research. I'd like to conduct a project evaluation. And I'd also like to make sure that that evaluation or that research is communicated through animation. So that's actually quite exciting, just to see that people are actually coming to us now and saying, I've seen a great animation online, and I'd like you to be able to produce something quite similar to it, if that's okay. So yeah, it's cool that people are actually saying that they want their own animation as well. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, from my perspective, you know, it's reusable. So it's not a kind of one moment it's communicated. It's something that can be shared and repeated in different audiences, and it doesn't seem to get old, in the sense it stays current. So it's been really important, I know, in my kind of generating of impact for my research. Vishnu, you have your hand up. You're on mute, so you need to come off mute.
And thank you, Tamsin. This was really interesting, very interesting presentation. I am less familiar with this type of the animation thing. Those are occasionally shared about them. When I listened to Dr. Louis Snyder, the theoretical, more conceptual part, it is quite interesting. But I have one concern, looking myself as audience and trying to compare this with the general documentary or with the general photograph. I feel more comfortable to understand the documentary or photograph compared to this animation. So my question to Louis or even Sajid, that are there any research which has demonstrated that the animation is more effective than the documentary or the photography? Because for me, when looking to the actual, it gives me a more closer reality than to depend on someone's imagination. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd take this one. I mean, there is a little bit of something called reception studies, which is kind of used in film research or people who are analyzing film and television and so forth, where they look at audiences and they see how receptive they are to different forms. And I think there's a growing receptivity, if that's a word, towards animation. But I do think there's a slight difference, because I think if there's a difference between recreation, animation and recreation, and animation in this sense, which is essentially telling nonfiction, but is describing findings and conclusions that are based in reality, but that don't have a link to a specific event. For example, like the let's think of a recent big event or something like that. But so if there's a specific event, animation might not be. If there's existing film footage or photographic evidence of something happening, then the reception to the photographic evidence would be high in terms of credibility. But what basically they found is that with more audiences now today, because of screen culture, and as Sajid says, I mean, just general daily life, we're actually engaging with animation on a much more regular basis. So the barrier between our accepting of it and acknowledging it as a way to impart information is much diminished. So it's much more of a fluid understanding and seeing animation as capable of communicating these things. But I do agree, I think, and there is a lot about this, is that the photographic, when it comes to the specificity of real events, if there is that evidence, that it does tend to work better. But actually what we're engaging with typically is something which is almost impossible to find the photographic or the film, the evidence, that sort of filmed or photographed evidence to support these things. So what we're actually really rendering is conclusions, nonfiction kind of conclusions based in research. So it's a slightly different thing that's being kind of evidenced, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Vishnu?
Yes, thank you very much. It was quite interesting. I got the insight there. Mainly, in Nepal specifically, maybe even in more other developing countries, the use of animation in the development practices and communicating issue is less practiced. And even if it don't somehow, it was mainly from the Western scholar or from the developed countries. So the practice itself is also very little. Now, in some of the television channels, they have started to do, and children are more attracted in my observation, but people like me, which are older people, may have difficulty to grasp that as well. What I realized based on listening to both Louis and Sajid, this is quite useful in the sensitive issues. For example, if we are not able to show the faces of the people violating the norms or abusing to the people. So in that case, it is quite effective, but in general case, it may be less effective. But the most important challenge for us in the South, in the developing sector, is to integrate it into the mainstream, so it could have more combined effect. So that is my observation. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. The practical tips Sajid gave is quite useful. Even it is useful for our research, other part, other than also dissemination. This writing simply, clarity. This excess slide was quite good, Sajid. Thank you for that as well. Thank you, Tamsin.
Thanks, Vishnu. Yeah, there is a question around, quite an interesting question actually, around the capacity in different parts of the world to actually produce animation. And I know Big Blue are obviously have a large base in Bangladesh, and I think your animation team are based there too. So I think that's an interesting topic to explore in terms of where that capacity is. There's certainly room potentially for kind of South-South partnerships in building greater capacity to do this kind of work. I'm just going to bring in a question that Mary posted in the chat quite some time ago. She's just commenting, Louis, on your animation, saying how wonderful it is, but she asked a question around what inspired you to explore this theme.
Well, that was largely because this was part of a bit of leftover GCRF money, essentially. And we got some kit for our partners in South Sudan. And initially, my initial thought was actually to make a comic exploring these outcomes. But then, because of coronavirus, and because of finding myself with a slightly more time than I may have had if I was teaching and doing all those things, I decided to take on the full whack of an animation, and also the fact that I had literally just finished a music video, so I was kind of limbered up in terms of thinking about kind of animation. But yeah, also I think animation is an incredible challenge. I do think there's a lot of challenges when it comes to making animation, and part of it is the time that it takes to make them, especially if you're a lone individual, kind of like myself, but also certain technical skills that are sort of built up over time and so forth. So yeah, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but I think, as Tamsin says, there is something quite lasting about the imagery, the sort of final thing. It tends to sort of also encourage kind of multiple readings. You get something a little bit different every time you engage with animation, which I think is a real positive as well. But yeah, that was, it was really because it was something that I wanted to do. And also I'd worked with Tamsin before on another project, which I felt was somewhat limited. It was more of a limited animation. I did want to sort of see something a bit more robustly done.
Thanks, Louis. I don't know if there's any more questions. Please just put your hand up if anybody has anything they want to share, reflections or specific questions. I think I'll come back actually to the question around building the capacity to be able to do animation, and ask Sajid and Saad to maybe comment on, how have you gone about building your team, and what you see is the challenges, because the last thing, the importance of animation in development is that it has to be something that's owned very much by the global South. So we don't want the creative process to be something that's led by constantly by institutions in the UK. As much as I know, Louis, we really did collaborate. It was a collaborative effort, the production of your animation. But still, we weren't able to draw on animators from South Sudan to produce it. So Sajid, maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tamsin. Yeah, I think so as you said, yeah. So some of our team is based in Bangladesh, and so for example, that animated film that we showed at the beginning of the presentation that I gave, so that was made entirely by colleagues of ours who work in Dhaka, in the capital. So I guess maybe one interesting point there is that, as I understand, there is not a single university animation degree in Bangladesh. So that means that every single person who is an animator has like made a choice kind of in isolation. Like they've made a personal choice to study it, to try and get involved in it. I just my own personal reflections, I've seen it quite often comes from people who were maybe working in graphic design and then they moved into animation, or maybe they were already working in something that was quite visual anyway, like architecture. So maybe they were involved with architecture software and then they moved into animation. So that kind of presents its own challenges, meaning like, there's not like it's quite often not like a theoretical base from people to work on. That's actually something that our team talks about internally quite a lot, is like, we'd love to see some kind of academic foundation for animation to start up in Bangladesh. There's not a lot of animators in Dhaka, so it's like a real search for people who are real kind of real gold. It's like an ongoing search, and so we're looking through like so many profiles all the time. And again, I mean, there's so many different kinds of animation as well. Like I think Louis' animations were, I mean, some of them had like several different kinds of animation within them. So it's like each one of those is its own field, and you could dedicate like your entire life just to doing one of those. But our particular approach is quite often what is most commonly known as 2D or two-dimensional animation. We're trying to experiment with other ways too, just to build those into our portfolio as well. But yeah, it's a wonderful challenge, because when you find someone to work with in Bangladesh, you just kind of want to like grab onto them and just say like, I don't ever go, because so that's, we're working on building our team up now. I guess one thing I will say is like, this is pluses and minuses. Like the barriers to entry for animation are becoming lower and lower all the time, meaning like it used to be a super exclusive domain, but because of like software is changing, and this is true for photography, for film, for animation, for graphic design, it's like software is making the barriers of entry lower, which means it's easier to start up it's easier to get involved in the field. So again, that's also, it's pluses and minuses. If you're already working in the field, that means more competition. It means price is also a consideration as well. Yeah, I think what we would love to see is like an animation degree or animation degrees be set up in Bangladesh, and then that will really change the landscape there. But I think until that happens, it's just going to be trying to find the best people that we can. And yeah, I don't really have a fixed answer to
I just
questions.
up in there one sec.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Actually, my colleague Lee Sherman worked on a project, and I put it in the chat. It's called Stories in Transit, and actually it happened in Italy. It was in Sicily, and they ran a series of workshops with refugees, and they actually created animations which were kind of allegorical about their lives, and they're really brilliant, and they're very, very much kind of handmade. And I wanted to show a video of it, but it just would have taken a bit too long. But if you just Google Stories in Transit, you'll see about the project. So I think things like that, those kind of interventions are quite interesting, almost sort of taster sessions for people, but enabling them a way to tell their story in that kind of means. But I mean, interesting enough, I mean, this might interest Tamsin, there's actually a animation exploitation in India. In fact, The Simpsons is being made in India, along with a lot of other animated films. And there's a sort of sweatshop and it's quite controversial. So exploiting people for cheap pay, animating commercial productions, and that's occurring in India and I believe in South Korea as well. But yeah, so so there is definitely some talent there, for sure, but unfortunately it is being exploited. But I would totally agree as well. I think, Sajid, that's a very good point. I think there is software. I mean, I used software which made life massively simpler, called Rough Animator, that I used for the Gender South Sudan project, which was hugely time saving, and it also makes the process a lot easier. So there are lots of ways to engage different audiences, different people with that. I think a place like Nairobi, which I'd be very interested in testing it, because there's a lot of there's actually an art school in Buruburu, and so forth. So you've got a lot of quite talented people, sort of in the 2D painting and drawing talent, which I think could easily transition to animation. So I'm definitely interested in exploring some of these things. But I think it's absolutely right. Participation and engaging with people on the ground to be contributing to the final shape and form of these things is absolutely critical. Definitely.
And I think, it strikes me that, from what Sajid, you were saying in terms of the growing interest in using animation in different kind of industries and sectors, hearing what Louis said about the exploitation that seems to be going along with that increase in demand, but there seems to be, opportunity maybe to create collaborative partnerships in order to build that kind of capacity at university level in places like Bangladesh and maybe even Nepal, Bishnu. I think that seems quite exciting to look at that. So we shall pose that to our global partnership team. But it's shocking to hear, Louis, what you were saying about animators being exploited in India. I had no idea that was going on.
Yep. So
can I ask that any further comments or questions? I'm quite happy to carry on just having a conversation, but I'm mindful there are other people in this virtual space. No? Any other final comments, Louis and Sajid, or you feel content that you've shared everything you wanted to?
I feel pretty content, I think, at the moment.
Good.
Same here. A lot of contentment.
Okay.
Thanks, Tamsin.
Okay, well, it just leaves it to me really to say a big thank you to Sajid and his team, and to Louis for giving us a really rich and fascinating webinar.